What if you suddenly lost everything at 70? Imagine waking up one morning feeling weak, unable to stand without help, your once strong body betraying you. This is the reality Grace Bennett faced, and her story might just spark a new beginning for you. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Grace had always been a fighter. At 70 years old, she was once the vibrant heart of her small Ohio town, a retired schoolteacher who spent decades shaping young minds. But lately, the mirror reflected someone she barely recognized. Her muscles, once toned from years of walking the school halls and tending her garden, now felt like fragile threads barely holding her up. One chilly autumn morning, as sunlight seeped softly through the window, Grace struggled to lift herself from the bed. Her hands gripped the mattress edge tightly, knuckles white with effort. She took a deep breath, willing her legs to obey. The familiar burn of weakness flared in her thighs, a reminder that time was no longer on her side. Just yesterday, she had tripped on the loose rug in the kitchen, bruising her hip and her pride. The incident gnawed at her independence like a persistent rat. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, a wave of frustration crashing over her. How had it come to this? What had she done to deserve this slow unraveling? She thought of her late husband, Frank, who had always told her she was stronger than she realized. But now, strength felt like a distant memory, slipping through her fingers like sand. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, she whispered to herself, remembering the video she had stumbled upon last night, stories of seniors who regained their vitality through unexpected means. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough, she mused. For Grace, it had always been her family, her daughter Amy and her grandson Jake. They were the light in her life, the reason she wanted to keep fighting. Yet, even their encouragement sometimes felt like a heavy burden. Amy's recent suggestion to move into assisted living had stung deeper than she admitted. She wanted to be strong for them, not a source of worry. Outside her window, the world bustled on, oblivious to her silent struggle. The autumn leaves danced in the wind, carefree and vibrant, mocking the stillness she felt inside. As Grace pushed herself up and shuffled toward the bathroom, every step was a battle. Her muscles protested, her balance wavered. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, silver hair framing tired eyes, skin marked by years of laughter and tears. Yet beneath that weariness was a spark, a flicker of determination refusing to be extinguished. That morning, she resolved to find a way back to strength. To reclaim the independence slipping away. What if the answer lay not in grand gestures but in a simple bedtime routine? Grace didn't know it yet, but her journey was about to begin, a journey that even someone like Elon Musk would approve of, blending science, routine, and a touch of grit. It started with a flyer she found tucked under her door, advertising a local wellness center offering a program designed to protect muscle health in seniors. Skeptical but desperate, Grace made a call. The voice on the other end was warm and encouraging, promising a personalized approach and a community of people just like her. That small step ignited a spark of hope. As the day wore on, Grace found herself reflecting on the past, her years as a teacher, the joy of seeing her students succeed, the love she shared with Frank, the heartbreak of losing him. Each memory was a thread woven into the fabric of who she was, a reminder that strength wasn't just physical but also emotional. And maybe, just maybe, she could weave those threads back together. The clock ticked steadily, the evening drawing near. Grace prepared for bed, moving slowly but with intention. Tonight would be different. She would try the new routine she learned about, no matter how small the steps. What if a simple change in her bedtime habits could protect her muscles, keep her strong, and help her stay in control of her life? The question lingered in her mind as she settled under the covers. Outside, the stars blinked awake, silent witnesses to her quiet resolve. Grace closed her eyes, imagining a future where she stood tall, walked freely, and laughed with her family without fear. That future was not so far away. All it took was one night, one routine, one choice to push forward. And maybe, just maybe, her story would inspire others facing the same fight. Because no matter the challenge, strength can always find a way. What's your strength? What pushes you forward when life feels like it's holding you back? Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and join Grace on this unexpected journey. This story is just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Grace Bennett's story didn't begin with weakness or fear. It began decades ago in a small town in Ohio where she first discovered her passion for teaching and the deep connections that would shape her life. Born in 1955, Grace grew up in a tight-knit community where neighbors knew each other by name and everyone pitched in when someone was in need. Her childhood was marked by hard work and resilience, lessons instilled by her parents who were first-generation Americans. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a nurse, and both had dreams of a better future for their children. Grace was the eldest of 3 siblings, a natural caretaker who often helped with her younger brother and sister. From an early age, she showed a bright mind and a compassionate heart, qualities that made her beloved by teachers and classmates alike. After graduating high school with honors, Grace attended a state university, majoring in education. It was there she met Frank Bennett, a charming young engineer with a quick smile and a love for adventure. They married soon after college, and together built a life centered around family, community, and shared dreams. Grace's career as a schoolteacher spanned over 40 years, mostly in the same elementary school where she had once been a student. She became known for her warmth, patience, and dedication, always going the extra mile for her students. Many of her former pupils would later tell her she had changed their lives, a fact that filled her with quiet pride. But life wasn't without its challenges. The death of her father when she was 35 left a void that never fully healed. When her mother moved into assisted living, Grace became her caregiver, juggling her job and family responsibilities with grace, pun intended, but also exhaustion. Her relationship with Frank was a source of strength through all of it. They shared laughter, struggles, and dreams of growing old together. That dream was shattered 5 years ago when Frank passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The loss plunged Grace into a deep sorrow that lingered longer than she expected. She found herself questioning everything, including her own resilience. With Frank gone, the house felt emptier, the future uncertain. Her daughter Amy, now 45, lived nearby with her husband and their teenage son Jake. Amy was Grace's rock, but also her fiercest critic when it came to her mother's health. Amy's concern grew as Grace's muscles weakened, noticing how her mother struggled with simple tasks like opening jars or standing up from a chair. "Mom, please consider moving in with us, or maybe assisted living," Amy urged gently but firmly during one of their weekly dinners. Grace bristled at the suggestion. Independence was her identity. The thought of losing it was unbearable. "I'm not ready to give up my home," she replied, voice tinged with stubbornness and hurt. Their conversations often ended in silence, a chasm of worry and frustration between them. Jake, the lively 16-year-old grandson, adored his grandmother. He loved hearing her stories about school days and always tried to make her laugh with silly jokes. But even Jake noticed the changes. One afternoon, he found Grace sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the garden she once tended with such care. "Grandma, why don't you come inside?" he asked, concern in his bright eyes. She smiled weakly. "Just thinking, honey. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we don't show." That line captured everything, Grace's invisible struggle, the silent wars fought beneath a calm exterior. Despite her physical decline, Grace's mind remained sharp, filled with memories, hopes, and dreams for the future. She was a woman caught between 2 worlds. The vibrant past she cherished and the uncertain present she navigated. Her backstory wasn't just about loss and pain but about love and resilience. Those emotional memories were the foundation of her character, the fuel that kept her going even when her muscles failed her. Her relationships shaped her motivations deeply. Amy's protective nature reminded Grace of the importance of family, while Jake's innocence brought light to dark days. Frank's memory was a constant companion, sometimes a source of comfort, sometimes a pang of sorrow. Grace's psychology was complex, part pride, part fear, part hope. She was stubborn enough to refuse help but wise enough to know she couldn't do it alone. This internal conflict defined much of her journey. The audience could feel her struggles through her actions, the hesitant grip on a coffee cup, the careful step down a staircase, the quiet sigh at the end of a long day. Through these moments, Grace's vulnerability was palpable, drawing the reader closer, building attachment and empathy. In her loneliness, Grace found solace in small rituals: morning coffee on the porch, phone calls with Amy, reading letters from former students. These relationships were lifelines, threads connecting her to a world that sometimes seemed to move too fast or too far away. Grace's story also touched on universal themes: aging, loss, pride, and the search for meaning. The audience could see themselves in her, or in their own loved ones. This connection made the story compelling, not just a tale of one woman's decline but a reflection on what it means to grow older with dignity and grace. At the heart of it was the question: how do we hold on to strength when our bodies betray us? How do we keep moving forward when every step feels harder than the last? Grace's answer would come slowly, through trials, setbacks, and unexpected hope. The chapter closed on an evening scene where Grace sat quietly in her living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls filled with family photos. She touched the picture of Frank and herself on their wedding day, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. The past was a comfort but also a reminder of all she wanted to protect: her memories, her independence, her family. And somewhere inside, beneath the layers of pain and fear, a seed of determination was taking root. Grace Bennett was ready for what came next. The journey to reclaim her strength was just beginning, and with it, the promise of new discoveries that might change everything. The audience was invited to keep following her story, to witness how one woman's resilience could inspire hope for many. The chapter ended with a quiet, powerful message: strength isn't just about muscle. It's about heart. And sometimes, the strongest battles are fought within. Grace Bennett's struggle to maintain her strength wasn't just a private battle, it began to ripple through her daily life in ways she could no longer ignore. The rising conflict wasn't sudden but a slow, creeping erosion of confidence and independence that chipped away at her resolve. One crisp Saturday morning, Grace decided to go to the grocery store, something she had done countless times over the years. The sun filtered through the colorful leaves, casting a golden light on the quiet streets of her neighborhood. She parked her car in the familiar lot and made her way inside, clutching her reusable shopping bag. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as she navigated the aisles, carefully selecting items from her list. But then, as she reached for a can on the bottom shelf, her knees buckled unexpectedly. Time seemed to slow as she stumbled, arms flailing to find balance. A sharp pain shot through her hip as she landed on the linoleum floor. Embarrassed and shaken, Grace quickly gathered herself with the help of a kind stranger. A small crowd gathered, murmuring concerned words. Grace's cheeks burned with humiliation. The fall was more than physical, it was a blow to her pride. The next day, Amy called to check in, her voice laced with worry. "Mom, you need to think about assisted living. It's safer, and you won't have to worry about things like this." Grace's heart tightened at the suggestion. She loved Amy dearly but resented the implication that she was no longer capable. "I'm fine, Amy," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "I just had a little accident. Nothing to worry about." But inside, doubt gnawed at her. That moment in the store crystallized everything she feared: losing control, becoming a burden, losing the home she cherished. The tension between mother and daughter grew, subtle but persistent. Amy's calls became more frequent, filled with gentle urgings and veiled concerns. Grace found herself avoiding them sometimes, retreating into silence. The once vibrant exchanges of love were now tinged with frustration and unspoken fears. Meanwhile, Grace's muscles continued to weaken. Simple tasks like climbing stairs or opening jars became daunting challenges. She noticed how her hands trembled slightly when reaching for the faucet, how her legs felt like lead after walking just a few blocks. These physical changes shook her confidence and fueled a growing sense of isolation. One afternoon, feeling particularly low, Grace sat in her favorite armchair, staring out the window at the garden she had nurtured for years. The flowers bloomed brightly, indifferent to her struggles. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old friend inviting her to a local community wellness event. She almost ignored it, but curiosity won. That flyer she had found earlier about the wellness center flashed in her mind. Maybe this was a sign. She called the center, spoke to a friendly voice named Dr. Carter who specialized in muscle health for seniors. Their conversation was warm, encouraging, and for the first time in months, Grace felt a flicker of hope. The wellness center promised a program designed specifically for people like her, combining science and simple routines to protect muscle and maintain independence. It sounded almost too good to be true, but Grace was ready to try. As she hung up, a cautious optimism settled in her chest. That day marked the first step in a rising journey filled with tension and hope, where Grace would face setbacks but also find new allies and strength. The conflict was no longer just internal, it was a push and pull with those who loved her and the physical limits of her aging body. Yet in this conflict lay the seed of transformation. Grace's story mirrored the experiences of many seniors wrestling with similar fears: how to stay strong, how to stay independent, how to stay hopeful. The narrative introduced the climax-hope-climax rhythm in her life, beginning with the fall, climax, finding support in Amy and the wellness center, hope, then confronting new challenges like setbacks and doubts, climax. This ebb and flow kept the tension alive, making Grace's journey relatable and gripping. The chapter painted vivid scenes: the sterile brightness of the grocery store, the comfort of the armchair by the window, the hopeful phone call to Dr. Carter. Emotions ran high: embarrassment, fear, love, determination, woven seamlessly into Grace's daily life. Readers could feel her trembling hands, her racing heart, her stubborn resolve. As the chapter closed, Grace prepared for her first visit to the wellness center. The night before, she lay awake, muscles aching, mind buzzing with questions. Would this routine really help? Could she trust someone new with her fragile hopes? She thought of Frank, of Amy, of Jake. Their faces filled her with warmth and resolve. Tomorrow would be a new chapter, a new chance. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes, ready to face the unknown. Grace arrived at the wellness center feeling a mixture of hope and nervousness. The building was modern yet welcoming, filled with natural light and the faint scent of eucalyptus. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by Dr. Carter, a woman in her 50s with a warm smile and an aura of calm confidence. "Grace, it's so good to meet you," she said, shaking her hand firmly. "We're going to work together to protect your muscle health and help you regain your independence." Grace nodded, a flicker of optimism lighting her eyes. The first session began with a thorough assessment, strength tests, balance evaluations, and a detailed conversation about her daily routine and diet. Dr. Carter explained how muscle loss in seniors, called sarcopenia, could be slowed or even reversed with the right interventions. She introduced Grace to a simple yet scientifically backed bedtime routine designed to boost muscle preservation during sleep, a concept that intrigued Grace deeply. The routine included light stretching, hydration strategies, and specific nutrient timing to maximize muscle repair overnight. As Grace learned about the science behind muscle recovery, she felt empowered. This was more than just exercise, it was a plan grounded in evidence, something even Elon Musk might appreciate for its innovative yet practical approach. Over the next few weeks, Grace began to integrate the routine into her evenings. It started slowly, a few stretches while breathing deeply, drinking a glass of water infused with electrolytes, and having a light snack rich in protein before bed. At first, the changes were subtle. She noticed small improvements in how she felt upon waking: less stiffness, a slight boost in energy. Encouraged, Grace kept going, often sharing her progress with Amy during their calls. Amy's tone softened as she saw her mother's determination paying off. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said one night. "Keep it up." Grace's social life, once diminished by fear of falling or embarrassment, began to revive. She joined a small group at the center where seniors met to share experiences and support each other. The camaraderie was uplifting, reminding Grace she was not alone in this fight. Yet, as progress blossomed, new challenges surfaced. One evening, after a particularly long day of errands and social visits, Grace felt an intense fatigue that sapped her willpower. She skipped the bedtime routine, curling into bed early and wondering if all her efforts were futile. The next morning, she awoke with a nagging ache in her legs and a sinking feeling of failure. Doubt crept in. Was her body too far gone? Would she ever regain the strength to live fully again? This moment of setback marked another climax in Grace's journey, a reminder that progress was rarely linear. But in that low point, hope re-emerged. The next call with Dr. Carter was a turning point. "Grace," the doctor said gently, "everybody has tough days. What matters is getting back on track. Your muscles remember your efforts, they respond to consistency and patience." Those words rekindled Grace's spirit. She recommitted herself to the routine, finding new resolve in the knowledge that setbacks were part of growth. The chapter vividly described these scenes: the bright wellness center, the gentle encouragement from Dr. Carter, the cozy group meetings filled with laughter and shared stories, and Grace's quiet moments of doubt and perseverance. The tension between struggle and hope kept readers engaged, mirroring real-life experiences. Grace's emotional journey was portrayed through her actions, how she pushed through fatigue, how her face lit up with small victories, how her conversations with Amy and new friends renewed her optimism. The rising conflict gave way to the unexpected turn in the story. The discovery that a consistent bedtime routine was not only possible but profoundly effective. It transformed Grace's nights from times of dread and weakness to moments of healing and strength building. The vivid descriptions of Grace's evolving routine and the detailed explanations of muscle science added depth and authenticity. The chapter ended with Grace lying in bed, muscles relaxed and mind calm, feeling the first true sense of hope in months. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to grow stronger. The adventure of reclaiming her life was just beginning, and Grace was ready to face whatever came next with courage. Grace's journey into reclaiming her strength reached an emotional climax that reshaped everything she thought she knew about aging and resilience. It happened unexpectedly one morning when she woke up feeling an unfamiliar surge of energy. The small improvements she had been making over weeks and months had culminated into a breakthrough. Her legs no longer trembled when she stood, and she could climb the stairs without clutching the railing. That day, Grace decided to visit the park she used to frequent with Frank, a place filled with memories of laughter, picnics, and lazy afternoons. As she walked along the tree-lined paths, the crisp air filling her lungs, she felt a profound sense of victory and gratitude. The physical progress mirrored a deeper emotional shift. She was no longer defined by her losses but by her determination and hope. However, the emotional climax was not without its shadows. Later that week, Grace received a call from Amy with distressing news. Amy's husband had lost his job, and the family was struggling financially. The added stress threatened to pull Grace back into a place of anxiety and helplessness. She wanted to support her daughter but feared her own fragility might make things worse. The timing felt cruel. Just as Grace was gaining strength, life's uncertainties threatened to unravel the fragile progress. Yet, this challenge also sparked a renewed sense of purpose. Grace resolved to be a pillar for her family, not a burden. She started sharing her new bedtime routine with Amy, encouraging her daughter to try simple habits to reduce stress and improve sleep quality. Their bond deepened as they faced hardship together, united by small rituals and shared hope. Grace also volunteered to help with Jake's school projects, rediscovering joy in their relationship and reminding herself that strength was as much about love as it was about muscle. The chapter captured this climax-hope-climax cycle vividly. The first peak of physical and emotional strength, climax, the hope found in family support and shared resilience, hope, followed by the new crisis threatening stability, climax. This dynamic kept the narrative gripping and real. Vivid descriptions of the park's golden autumn leaves, the warmth of family dinners, and the quiet moments of reflection gave the story cinematic depth. Readers could see Grace's hands steady as she helped Jake, hear the tension and tenderness in Amy's voice, and feel the bittersweet blend of hope and worry that defined their lives. Grace's internal dialogue revealed her fears and aspirations, her gratitude for progress, her dread of setbacks, and her fierce love for her family. The emotional climax underscored the story's core message: resilience is not a straight path but a winding journey filled with peaks and valleys. The audience was invited to witness not just Grace's physical transformation but her growth as a woman learning to balance vulnerability with strength. As the chapter drew to a close, Grace sat by the window in the evening light, reflecting on all she had overcome and the challenges still ahead. She whispered to herself, "Life is full of surprises, but love will always lead the way." That sentence echoed the story's meaningful message, leaving readers with a sense of hope and encouragement. This moment of reflection set the stage for the upcoming resolution, where Grace's journey toward maturity and peace would culminate. The chapter ended with Grace preparing for another night of her bedtime routine, feeling a profound connection to her body and spirit. The once daunting task had become a ritual of empowerment, a nightly affirmation that she was still fighting, still growing. Tomorrow held uncertainty, but Grace was ready. She had learned that the strongest battles are not always visible, but they are the ones that define us. Grace's newfound strength and emotional clarity marked a turning point, yet the journey toward full recovery was far from over. The days that followed blended routine with revelation as Grace deepened her commitment to the bedtime ritual. Each evening, she carefully followed the steps Dr. Carter had outlined: gentle stretches to awaken tired muscles, sipping water infused with magnesium to ease cramps, and savoring a small protein-rich snack to fuel overnight repair. The ritual became a quiet celebration of self-care, a sacred pause in the rush of life. Her bedroom transformed into a sanctuary where science met serenity. She marveled at how this simple routine, one she almost dismissed at first, was reshaping not only her muscles but her mindset. She began journaling, jotting down how her body felt each morning, the small victories and setbacks. The act of writing made the intangible progress tangible, helping her see patterns and stay motivated. Outside the bedroom, Grace re-engaged with the world. The park visits became a regular joy, her steps more confident as she greeted neighbors and shared stories with fellow walkers. She joined a local book club, finding camaraderie and intellectual stimulation. Her laughter returned, richer and more frequent, filling spaces that had grown quiet after Frank's passing. However, the story's rising conflict re-emerged in new forms. Amy's financial worries intensified, casting shadows over family gatherings. Jake faced pressure at school, and Grace felt the tug of wanting to protect them while also tending to her fragile health. Balancing these demands tested her resolve. One evening, after helping Jake with a difficult math problem, Grace felt a sharp twinge in her back. Panic fluttered briefly but was replaced by determination. She reminded herself of the lessons learned, the importance of pacing, listening to her body, and trusting the process. Rather than retreat, she adapted her routine, consulting Dr. Carter, who suggested modifications to ease strain while maintaining muscle activation. This adaptability became a key theme, emphasizing that recovery is not rigid but fluid. The narrative wove together detailed scenes. Grace's morning stretches bathed in golden sunlight, the comforting aroma of herbal tea shared with Amy, the quiet focus as Jake worked through homework, and moments of solitude filled with reflective journaling. Through these images, readers experienced the ebb and flow of Grace's days, the blend of joy and challenge. Emotionally, Grace grew in complexity, her resilience tempered by vulnerability, her independence balanced with openness to support. The chapter explored her psychology deeply, revealing how the bedtime routine was more than physical, it was symbolic of her reclaiming control over aging and uncertainty. Grace's relationships blossomed alongside her progress. Conversations with Amy shifted from tension to tenderness as they found new ways to support each other. Jake's youthful energy became a source of inspiration rather than worry. Even neighbors noticed the change, offering smiles and encouragement. This social renewal underscored the story's message that strength is interconnected: muscle, mind, and community. The chapter also introduced a subtle twist. Grace discovered an online forum for seniors dedicated to muscle health and wellness. Engaging with others who shared her journey brought fresh motivation and ideas. She began sharing her own experiences, becoming an unexpected source of encouragement. This digital connection highlighted the modern intersection of technology and aging, something even Elon Musk might find intriguing. As the chapter closed, Grace prepared for bed with a calm certainty. The bedtime routine was no longer a chore but a ritual of empowerment. She stretched, sipped her magnesium water, and enjoyed her snack, feeling gratitude for the science that made it possible and the love that sustained her. Lying down, she smiled softly, thinking, "This is just the beginning." The chapter ended on a hopeful note, reinforcing that while challenges remained, Grace was equipped to face them with courage, wisdom, and an open heart. Her journey was ongoing, a testament to the power of persistence and the profound impact of simple, consistent habits. Grace's transformation was gaining momentum, yet the path remained strewn with challenges that tested her resolve and spirit. One crisp morning, as she prepared for her daily walk, a letter arrived in the mail that threatened to disrupt the fragile balance she had fought so hard to achieve. The envelope was from her longtime insurance provider, containing news that her premiums were increasing dramatically due to her age and recent medical history. The financial strain added a new layer of tension to her already complicated life. Grace felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Memories of past hardships surfaced, times when bills piled up and the future seemed uncertain. This setback wasn't just about money, it was a stark reminder of vulnerability. Yet, Grace refused to let despair take hold. Drawing on the resilience honed through months of perseverance, she resolved to face this new obstacle head-on. She reached out to a local senior advocacy group recommended by a friend from the wellness center. There, she met people navigating similar struggles, stories of frustration mixed with hopeful solutions. Empowered by community, Grace learned about assistance programs and strategies to appeal insurance decisions. This connection sparked a new wave of determination. Grace also doubled down on her bedtime routine, seeing it as her personal armor against stress and physical decline. Each night, the ritual of stretches, hydration, and nutrition grounded her, offering a sense of control amid uncertainty. The narrative explored this cycle of conflict and hope through vivid scenes, the quiet disappointment of opening the letter, the warmth of the advocacy group meetings filled with chatter and camaraderie, and the intimate moments at home where Grace found solace in her routine. Emotionally, the chapter delved into Grace's internal struggle. Fear of losing stability, frustration with systemic challenges, but above all, a fierce will to protect her independence and dignity. Amid the practical battles, Grace's relationships deepened in unexpected ways. Amy, sensing her mother's burden, began sharing more of her own struggles, creating a new level of openness and mutual support between them. Jake, too, showed maturity, surprising Grace with thoughtful gestures like making her tea or organizing her medications. These interactions highlighted the theme that strength was as much about connection as it was about physical health. The chapter also introduced a subtle yet powerful twist. Grace was invited to speak at a local senior health forum about her experiences with muscle preservation and the bedtime routine. The invitation was both thrilling and intimidating. Public speaking was far from her comfort zone, yet she recognized it as an opportunity to inspire others and reinforce her own commitment. With guidance from Dr. Carter and encouragement from Amy, Grace prepared her speech, weaving personal stories with scientific insights. This moment marked a new climax, facing fear to step into a role of leadership and advocacy. The detailed description of the forum, the packed room, attentive faces, and the mix of nerves and excitement, immersed readers in Grace's experience. Her voice, steady yet heartfelt, resonated as she shared the impact of consistent habits and hope on her life. The chapter closed with Grace reflecting on the unexpected ways her journey had expanded beyond personal healing to community impact. Lying in bed that night, following her trusted routine, she felt a deep sense of purpose and peace. Challenges would come and go, but the routine and the connections it fostered were now part of her identity. Grace whispered to herself, "Strength isn't just muscle. It's heart, courage, and the will to keep going." The chapter ended on an empowering note, reinforcing the story's core message and setting the stage for further growth and discovery. Grace's speech at the Senior Health Forum became a defining moment, not just for the audience but for herself. Standing before the crowd, her heart raced, but beneath the nerves was a steady current of pride and purpose. She recounted her journey, from the frightening fall at the grocery store to discovering a simple bedtime routine that transformed her life. She spoke candidly about the struggles of aging, the fear of losing independence, and the power of hope and science combined. As she described the stretches, the hydration, and the protein snack before sleep, she noticed nods of recognition and the spark of possibility in the eyes of those listening. Afterward, several attendees approached her, eager to share their own stories and ask questions. Grace felt a profound connection, a reminder that her journey resonated far beyond her own experience. This new role as a mentor and advocate ignited a fresh passion. Back home, the impact of the speech rippled through her relationships. Amy called with renewed warmth and respect, inspired by her mother's courage. Jake, proud of his grandmother's accomplishment, gifted her a framed photo from the event. Even neighbors, some who had been distant, stopped by to offer congratulations and share their own health goals. Grace's confidence blossomed, reflected in every smile and steady step. Yet, life remained a balancing act. The ongoing financial worries from the insurance premium increase required careful budgeting and tough choices. Grace and Amy worked together, combining their resources and planning thoughtfully. These practical challenges underscored the reality that resilience involves not just physical health but navigating life's complexities with grace. The bedtime routine, however, was a constant sanctuary. One evening, Grace discovered a new element to add: meditation and deep breathing exercises before the stretches. The practice calmed her restless mind, improved sleep quality, and further eased muscle tension. She incorporated these mindfulness moments, embracing the full spectrum of wellness, body, mind, and spirit. The chapter vividly portrayed these developments through detailed scenes, the vibrant energy of the forum, the quiet intimacy of mother-daughter planning sessions, and the serene moments of meditation by moonlight. Grace's emotions were laid bare, her exhilaration after the speech, the tenderness in Amy's supportive calls, the peace found in mindful breathing. This layering of experience enriched the narrative, inviting readers to feel alongside her. A subtle tension persisted, however. Grace noticed occasional stiffness returning, a reminder that progress required vigilance and adaptation. She discussed these concerns with Dr. Carter, who encouraged adjustments and reinforced that aging was a journey with ups and downs. This honesty strengthened Grace's resolve rather than diminishing it. Toward the chapter's end, Grace began exploring online platforms to share her story and bedtime routine tips more broadly. She started a blog, reaching out to a growing community of seniors eager for practical, science-backed advice. The digital engagement connected her with people across the country, expanding her sense of purpose and belonging. The chapter closed with Grace preparing for bed after a long day of writing and correspondence. She moved through her routine with a calm confidence, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting gentle shadows. As she stretched and sipped her magnesium water, she reflected on how far she had come, from fear and isolation to connection and empowerment. She whispered, "Every night is a new chance to rebuild, to heal, to grow." The chapter ended on a note of quiet triumph, blending hope and realism, and setting the stage for the next phase of Grace's remarkable journey. Grace's life had become a delicate balance of routines, relationships, and responsibilities, each thread woven carefully to support her newfound strength and independence. The bedtime ritual remained the anchor, a nightly act of hope and healing. But this chapter of her journey introduced a new challenge: one that tested not only her physical stamina but also her emotional resilience. It began on a cool spring morning when Grace noticed a sharp pain in her right shoulder. At first, she dismissed it as a minor strain, perhaps from gardening or carrying groceries. But as days passed, the discomfort grew, interfering with her stretches and daily activities. Concerned, she scheduled an appointment with her physician, who diagnosed her with early-stage rotator cuff tendinitis, a common ailment in seniors but one that threatened to derail her progress if left untreated. The news weighed heavily on Grace. She feared losing the mobility she had fought so hard to regain and dreaded the possibility of months spent in painful physical therapy or worse, surgery. The diagnosis felt like a cruel twist in a story that had already tested her limits. Yet, true to her nature, Grace approached this setback with cautious optimism. She consulted with Dr. Carter, who crafted a modified exercise plan that respected her shoulder's limits while maintaining overall muscle engagement. They introduced gentle range of motion movements, cold compresses, and anti-inflammatory nutrition to reduce swelling. The adjustment required patience and humility, qualities Grace learned to embrace. The chapter painted vivid scenes of Grace's struggle, the frustration of limited movement, the quiet determination during slow rehab exercises, the sting of pain balanced by moments of relief. Readers felt her vulnerability through descriptions of her furrowed brow and clenched jaw during difficult stretches and the soft sighs of satisfaction after successful days. Emotionally, the narrative delved into Grace's inner dialogue, her fear of regression, her anger at her body's betrayal, but also her gratitude for the support system surrounding her. Amy stepped up, taking on more household chores and offering gentle encouragement. Jake, sensing his grandmother's struggle, made a colorful, "Get well soon" card, a bright spot amid the challenges. Socially, Grace's participation in the senior group slowed, leading to feelings of isolation. Yet, the online community she had built through her blog became a lifeline. Sharing her pain and progress with followers elicited messages of empathy and advice, reminding her she was part of a larger movement. This digital solidarity fueled her spirit. The chapter wove in the tension and hope dynamic, the physical pain and limitations, climax, the emotional and community support that uplifted her, hope, followed by the realistic recognition that recovery would be gradual and ongoing, climax. This interplay kept the story grounded and compelling. Grace's character development deepened as she confronted the limits of her body with grace and grit. She learned new ways to listen, adapting her expectations and celebrating small wins. The narrative showed this evolution through detailed actions, her careful movements during stretches, her mindful breathing to manage discomfort, her thoughtful journaling about the ups and downs. The chapter also included reflections on aging's complexity, acknowledging that progress is not always linear and that strength includes accepting vulnerability. Toward the end, Grace began experimenting with adaptive tools recommended by occupational therapists, a lightweight brace to support her shoulder at night, ergonomic kitchen utensils to ease strain, and voice-activated technology to reduce physical effort. These innovations symbolized the modern blend of science, technology, and personal resilience. The chapter closed with Grace lying in bed, carefully following her bedtime routine modified to accommodate her injury. She stretched gently, sipped her magnesium water, and reflected on the lessons learned. Pain was an unwelcome companion but not an end. She whispered, "Strength is not the absence of struggle, but the courage to keep moving through it." The chapter ended on a tone of determined hope, reinforcing that setbacks are part of the journey and that perseverance defines true strength. Grace's battle with shoulder pain had deepened her understanding of resilience and adaptation. As spring turned to summer, she embraced the evolving nature of her journey, realizing that healing was not just about muscle but mindset. This chapter explored how Grace integrated new strategies into her routine and life, transforming challenges into opportunities for growth. Determined to regain her mobility, Grace attended physical therapy sessions twice a week, often accompanied by Amy who offered encouragement and practical help. The clinic became a place of hope and hard work, filled with the hum of equipment and the steady guidance of therapists who celebrated every inch of progress. Grace learned specialized exercises that strengthened her shoulder without strain, complemented by targeted massage and heat treatments. Each session was a test of patience and persistence. Alongside therapy, Grace deepened her commitment to nutrition. She consulted a dietitian who tailored a meal plan rich in anti-inflammatory foods, berries, leafy greens, fatty fish, and adequate protein to support muscle repair. Grace experimented with recipes, savoring meals that nourished both body and soul. These changes reinforced her bedtime routine, adding a mindful evening meal and a cup of turmeric tea known for its soothing properties. Emotionally, Grace felt a growing sense of empowerment. She journaled regularly, reflecting on progress and setbacks, using writing as a tool to process emotions and celebrate resilience. The chapter painted vivid scenes, the quiet determination in the therapy room, the fragrant kitchen alive with fresh ingredients, the peaceful moments of journaling by the window as sunlight warmed her face. Readers were invited into Grace's world of disciplined care balanced with small joys. Family remained central. Amy's support grew, their relationship evolving into a partnership of mutual care and respect. Jake's curiosity about his grandmother's regimen sparked playful conversations about science and health, bridging generational gaps. Grace's social life revived as she resumed attending the senior wellness group, where she shared her latest challenges and triumphs. These connections reinforced the story's theme that strength flourishes in community. Yet, the journey was not without its emotional turbulence. Some days, pain and fatigue threatened to overwhelm Grace, igniting doubts and frustration. The narrative revealed these moments with raw honesty, tears shed quietly during nighttime stretches, a faltering voice confiding fears to Amy, the inner dialogue wrestling with the desire to give up. But each dark moment was met with a spark of hope, encouraging words from friends, a small victory in therapy, or the soothing comfort of the bedtime ritual. The chapter employed the climax hope climax structure effectively, mirroring the natural ebb and flow of recovery. A subtle twist unfolded when Grace discovered that her experience inspired others beyond her immediate circle. A follower from her blog reached out, sharing how Grace's story motivated them to start their own muscle-preserving routines. This connection emphasized the ripple effect of personal transformation, adding depth to Grace's evolving identity as not just a survivor but a beacon of hope. The chapter closed with Grace preparing for bed after a full day of therapy, cooking, and connecting. She moved through her routine with steady grace, her body tired but her spirit renewed. As she stretched gently and sipped her magnesium-infused water, she reflected on the path ahead, uncertain but promising. Whispering to herself, she said, "Every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory." The chapter ended on a note of quiet determination, celebrating the resilience of the human spirit and the power of consistent care. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The summer days stretched long and warm, filled with a new rhythm that Grace had built piece by piece. Her bedtime routine had evolved beyond a physical necessity into a calming ritual that provided not only muscle support but mental clarity and emotional grounding. But just as Grace began to feel a sense of momentum, both in her physical recovery and her personal growth, life threw another curve. One morning in late July, Amy called, her voice low and uncertain. "Mom, it's Dad," she said quietly, referring to her ex-husband and Grace's former spouse, Mark. "He's sick. Cancer. It's spreading fast." The news hit Grace like a sudden chill, a wave of memories rising uninvited. Though they had parted decades earlier, Mark had been a formative part of her life. They had raised Amy together through years of struggle and sacrifice before ultimately drifting apart, their love lost to time and silence. But now, hearing that he was dying, Grace felt a strange tangle of emotions, grief, regret, empathy, and confusion. Amy asked if Grace would be willing to visit him. At first, Grace resisted. "I don't know what I would say," she murmured. "After all these years." But that night, lying in bed after her stretches and tea, she found herself staring at the ceiling, the room quiet except for the hum of the fan and the soft crack of joints settling into rest. Something stirred in her. Not guilt, exactly, but a need to close a chapter that had been left open far too long. The next morning, Grace agreed to go. The visit was awkward at first. Mark looked frail, hunched in a recliner with oxygen tubes beneath his nose. His voice was raspy but still carried a hint of the charm she once knew. They exchanged pleasantries, circling each other emotionally, unsure of how deep to wade into the past. But over the course of several visits, the walls began to lower. They talked about Amy, about the early days when money was tight and love was raw. They laughed at old arguments and sat in companionable silence when words failed. Mark apologized for the way things ended, and Grace found herself forgiving him, not out of obligation, but from the realization that life was too short to carry bitterness. These scenes were described in soft detail, the sterile smell of the hospice room, the way Grace would bring fresh-cut flowers to brighten his bedside, the tender way Mark's hand shook when he reached for hers. Their reconciliation, though brief, added another dimension to Grace's journey, closure. It also took an emotional toll. Each visit drained her, and she often returned home with a heart heavy with reflection. Her evening routine became more essential than ever. It was the one part of the day where she could breathe deeply, stretch out the grief, and remind herself that peace came in honoring the past, not escaping it. Dar. Carter noticed the emotional weight Grace was carrying and adjusted their sessions to include more restorative practices, gentle yoga poses, mindfulness meditations, and journaling prompts centered on letting go. These new additions complemented Grace's bedtime flow and helped her integrate emotional healing into her physical routine. Meanwhile, the blog continued to grow. More seniors reached out, inspired not only by Grace's health tips but also by her honesty about loss, love, and aging. One reader, a retired science teacher from Minnesota, wrote, "Your story makes me feel like it's not too late to take back control of my body, or my story." Grace was humbled. She never intended to be a role model, but now she felt a responsibility to show others that change was possible, no matter the age or circumstance. Jake, ever curious, began asking questions about his grandfather. Grace chose to answer with truth but also compassion, helping him understand that people are complex and that forgiveness can be a kind of freedom. The family dinners that followed were filled with richer conversations and a softness that hadn't always been there. The chapter also introduced a new challenge. Grace's sleep became more erratic, disturbed by dreams of her past and the emotional residue of her visits to Mark. She spoke with her doctor, who suggested adding light exposure in the morning and limiting screen time in the evening, small tweaks that made her routine even more refined. Grace added 10 minutes of morning sunlight to her walk, breathing in the early air while letting her circadian rhythm recalibrate. These scenes added texture to the narrative, Grace sitting quietly in the morning sun, eyes closed, feeling the warmth on her skin and imagining her cells repairing. The chapter followed the climax-hope-climax structure with precision, the emotional shock of Mark's illness, climax, the healing power of reconnection and forgiveness, hope, and the residual pain that disrupted her sleep and stability, climax. Yet, each turn was met with Grace's determination to adapt. She didn't run from discomfort, she used it to evolve. The chapter closed with Grace writing in her journal before bed. She scribbled a short entry. Sometimes we must visit the ghosts of our past to clear the way forward. Tonight, I stretch not just my body, but my heart. She folded the notebook, reached for her warm tea, and performed her final stretch, feeling the tightness in her chest slowly melt into something softer. The day had taken much from her, but her routine gave something back. In the quiet of her room, surrounded by dim light and familiar objects, Grace knew she was stronger than the sum of her pain. She whispered aloud, "I'm not finished yet." The chapter ended on a deeply reflective note, rich in emotion and insight, bridging the halfway mark of the story with a powerful blend of pain, healing, and forward motion. Grace felt the weight of the last few weeks settle in her bones. Mark's decline had been swift, and though their visits had brought closure, they also stirred old wounds she hadn't realized were still tender. When the phone call came, Mark had passed in his sleep. It was Amy who wept the most, but Grace felt the world slow down in a different way. She didn't cry immediately. She sat still for a long time, staring at the corner of the room where the afternoon sunlight pooled like gold on the floorboards. Later that evening, when the house was quiet, Grace performed her bedtime routine more slowly than usual. Every stretch felt like a gesture of reverence, every sip of her warm magnesium water like a blessing. Her body moved gently, remembering the man who had once held her hand during youth's stormiest seasons. That night, sleep came in waves. She dreamed not of Mark but of a younger version of herself, vibrant, laughing, dancing barefoot in the backyard of their first house. It wasn't a memory she had thought of in years, and when she woke, her cheeks were damp, but she felt lighter. The funeral was small. Grace stood beside Amy and Jake, her presence a quiet pillar. She didn't say much, but her steady gaze and calm breath seemed to center those around her. Afterward, at Amy's house, she sat at the kitchen table and listened to stories about Mark, his bad jokes, his relentless optimism, the way he'd always been late to everything. She laughed softly with the others, and when Jake asked if she was okay, she bent down and kissed his forehead. "I'm good, sweetheart. I really am." Emotionally, the chapter moved into a space of introspection and transition. With the past finally laid to rest, Grace felt a shift inside her, as if space had opened for something new. It wasn't immediate or loud, but it was undeniable. She returned to her daily walks with a new sense of freedom, her steps light, her breath deeper. She no longer avoided certain songs or corners of town that once held memories. Instead, she embraced them. The narrative began to show this transformation in her habits. Grace started experimenting with new evening routines, introducing lavender oil to her diffuser, swapping her usual herbal tea for chamomile and valerian root, and adding a gratitude practice just before bed. Every night, after her stretches and journaling, she would write down 3 things she was grateful for. At first, they were simple: sunshine, Amy's hug, clean sheets. But over time, they deepened: the strength to forgive, the resilience of my body, the love that still lives in my heart. Dr. Carter noticed the change. At their next appointment, he commented on her improved posture and muscle tone, but more than that, he said, "You look calm, Grace. Like something inside has settled." Grace smiled and nodded. "It has," she said. She no longer saw her routine as a chore or even as therapy. It had become ritual, spiritual in a way. It connected her to herself, to her breath, to the small but vital triumphs of the day. The story's emotional landscape broadened as Grace began reaching out to others more deliberately. She started attending community meetings on senior wellness and even volunteered to lead a class on building a nighttime routine for muscle health. At first, only 5 people signed up. By the end of the second week, the room was full. Grace stood in front of them with a printed handout, her voice strong but warm, and said, "This routine isn't about being perfect. It's about honoring your body every single night. Telling it, I see you. I thank you. Let's do this again tomorrow." The response was overwhelming. People approached her afterward with gratitude, saying no one had spoken to them with such sincerity about aging and strength. Grace felt a renewed purpose. For the first time since Frank died, and even before then, she felt like she was building something meaningful, not just for herself but for others. The blog, too, grew rapidly. A segment from her evening class was filmed and shared by one of the attendees. It caught traction online, and soon she was invited to record a podcast episode for a senior wellness network. She spoke about the science behind muscle preservation, yes, but she also told her story, how she had nearly lost her independence, and how a bedtime routine changed everything. The podcast became one of the network's most downloaded episodes of the year. This brought a new wave of followers to Grace's blog, including professionals and researchers who reached out to collaborate. One message stood out. It was from a team at a university researching the impact of nighttime routines on aging populations. They asked Grace to participate in a pilot study. She hesitated, being studied felt invasive, but after a long talk with Amy and a good night's rest, she agreed. The study involved tracking her evening habits, monitoring sleep quality, and measuring mobility markers over 8 weeks. Grace found it fascinating. The data gave her new insight into how even the smallest changes, like adjusting the timing of her snack or doing one stretch slower, affected her recovery and rest. She shared these findings with her blog readers, demystifying the science in simple, honest language. Through it all, Grace remained grounded in her routine. No matter how exciting the day, she always returned to her room at the same hour, dimmed the lights, turned on soft instrumental music, and began. She moved slowly and deliberately, each stretch a thank you, each breath a promise. Her journal now filled not just with daily reflections, but with letters to her future self, reminders to be kind, to be curious, to stay strong. The chapter closed with Grace sitting on her bed, the room quiet except for the gentle hum of her diffuser. She reached for her journal and wrote, "Tonight, I feel powerful. Not because of what I've overcome, but because I've chosen to keep going, no matter what. I am still here. Still strong. Still becoming." Then she closed the notebook, adjusted her pillow, and lay down. As her eyes fluttered shut, her muscles relaxed into the mattress like a flower opening to light. The chapter ended on a tone of calm triumph, signaling a midpoint in the story where survival had turned into something greater, thriving. Grace had always believed that life came in seasons, and now, as August rolled into September, she felt herself entering a season of deep strength and gentle revelation. Her bedtime routine had become not only second nature but a sacred rhythm, one that carried her through long days of advocacy, discovery, and emotional evolution. The research study she'd agreed to participate in continued, and Grace found herself fascinated by the intersection of data and lived experience. Wearing a lightweight sleep tracker at night and recording her movements during the day, she became more attuned to the cause and effect cycle between her habits and her health. On days when she skipped a stretch or ate a late, unbalanced meal, her sleep became lighter, her body less cooperative. But when she honored the full routine, stretching, protein-rich snack, magnesium water, calming music, and journaling, she felt restored by morning, as though her body thanked her for her commitment. The university researchers were impressed. Her consistency, combined with her honesty in reporting everything from aches to emotional fluctuations, made her data some of the most valuable in the study. They began quoting her in early drafts of their white papers, not just as a subject, but as a voice. "This routine isn't about vanity or trying to turn back the clock," she told them during one interview. "It's about showing up for yourself, even when no one's watching. Especially then." Outside of the study, Grace's life expanded in new ways. Amy encouraged her to turn her blog into a small online course, just something simple, "Mom. A few videos. Maybe a guidebook." Grace hesitated at first. Technology wasn't her comfort zone. But with Amy's help and Jake's enthusiastic assistance with filming, they produced a 5-part series titled Evening Strength, a bedtime routine for aging gracefully. The first module focused on the why. The science of muscle loss after 60, the danger of frailty, and the little-known importance of nighttime nutrition. The next modules took viewers step by step through Grace's own routine, from specific stretches to teas that helped induce sleep to the importance of mindset and gratitude. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from viewers across the country, seniors, caregivers, middle-aged adults looking to help their parents. Some messages were practical: "What kind of magnesium do you use?" Others were deeply personal: "I watched this with my mother. We cried. We're doing this together now." Grace felt humbled, even a little in awe. She wasn't just healing, she was helping others heal. Yet with growth came new kinds of pressure. Managing emails, interviews, and course feedback began to fill her afternoons. Some nights, she felt the old fatigue creep back in, and she had to remind herself not to abandon her own routine in the name of helping others maintain theirs. One evening, after a long day of responding to messages and working with Amy to plan a webinar, Grace skipped her stretches. Just this once, she told herself. But her body noticed. Her sleep was shallow, her legs ached in the morning, and her energy dipped noticeably the next day. It was a wake-up call. She wrote about it in her blog with complete transparency. "Even I forget sometimes," she posted. "But our bodies don't. They always remember. And they always respond, with grace or with protest." That post went viral within her community. People loved her honesty. She wasn't a guru on a pedestal, she was one of them, walking the same road. The chapter emphasized this duality, Grace as both teacher and student, constantly learning from her own choices. Emotionally, she also experienced a quiet awakening in her personal life. During one of the wellness classes at the center, she reconnected with someone she hadn't seen in years, Robert, a retired high school teacher who used to live 2 streets over. They'd crossed paths during community events decades ago, but life had pulled them in separate directions. Now, both in their 70s, they found themselves drawn to one another not with urgency but with a calm kind of curiosity. They began taking morning walks together, sharing stories of loss and renewal. Robert had lost his wife 5 years earlier and had spent much of the pandemic alone, learning how to cook and trying to keep his spirits up. Grace spoke of Frank and of Mark, of Amy and Jake, and of the strange beauty in starting over later in life. These scenes were tender, painted with slow walks under yellowing trees, gentle smiles across coffee cups, and hands brushing without urgency. Grace didn't know what it meant, not yet, but she allowed herself to feel it, the warmth, the possibility. She found herself journaling about it at night, uncertain but open. "I thought love came only once, or maybe twice if you were lucky. But maybe connection isn't bound by time. Maybe healing makes room for more." Meanwhile, the muscle-building research gained more traction, and the university invited Grace to speak at an upcoming conference on aging. The event would bring together doctors, gerontologists, and wellness experts from around the country. The thought of speaking to professionals both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm not a scientist," she told Dr. Carter. "I'm just me." But Dr. Carter smiled. "That's exactly why they need to hear you." She agreed, but the decision brought back waves of doubt. Could she speak in front of doctors and researchers and hold her ground? Would they take her seriously? That night, her routine soothed her nerves. As she moved through the stretches, she thought about everything she had learned, not from books, but from experience. From falling in the store to standing at Mark's bedside. From the first painful stretch to the 100 since. From quiet evenings alone to the laughter-filled ones with Amy and Jake. She knew her story mattered. And she knew how to tell it. The chapter ended with Grace rehearsing in front of a mirror, note cards in hand, her voice steady but soft. "I'm not here to tell you what works in a lab," she said aloud, practicing the opening line she'd written. "I'm here to show you what works in a living room, on a tired body, in a real life. I'm here to show you that it's never too late to get stronger." She paused, let the silence settle, and smiled at her reflection. Her bedtime routine would carry her through whatever came next. The story, like her body, was still unfolding. The auditorium lights were warm and low as Grace stood backstage at the National Aging and Wellness Conference. The quiet hum of an audience gathering filled the space, and through the heavy curtain, she could hear snippets of conversation, doctors in pressed suits, researchers flipping through programs, health coaches sipping coffee. It wasn't her usual crowd. These weren't her blog readers or neighbors from the wellness center. These were experts, people who studied longevity and muscle loss and biomechanics for a living. And yet, as she looked down at the note cards in her hand, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt ready. Her routine the night before had been sacred, uninterrupted. She'd performed her stretches slowly, holding each pose a few seconds longer, visualizing her muscles receiving gratitude. Her tea had been steeped to perfection, and she'd written in her journal, "I am here to serve, not to impress." That sentence had anchored her all morning. When the announcer called her name, Grace Atwood, wellness advocate and founder of the blog Evening Strength. The applause was polite but curious. She walked on stage with measured steps, wearing a soft blue blouse and slacks, her silver hair pulled back neatly. She didn't carry slides or charts. Just a single image projected behind her, a photo of her bedside table, tea mug, stretch band, lavender oil, journal, and a small framed picture of Amy and Jake. "This," she began, "is what saved me." A quiet ripple moved through the room. She told her story simply, without embellishment. The fall. The fear. The creeping realization that her muscles, and her confidence, were fading. The late-night research, the slow construction of her bedtime routine, the decision to take control. She wove in science, not with jargon, but with clarity. She referenced sarcopenia, the importance of protein synthesis during sleep, the benefits of pre-sleep stretching for reducing cortisol and improving recovery. She cited her experience in the university's pilot study. But most importantly, she made it personal. "We don't need miracle cures," she said, her voice steady. "We need routines. We need to believe that it's not too late. Because if someone like me, who once felt invisible, can rebuild strength, then so can anyone in this room, or anyone watching from their living room at home." The audience leaned in. When she finished, they rose in a standing ovation, not thunderous, but deeply genuine. Grace stepped off the stage with tears in her eyes, not from nerves or exhaustion, but from a sense of having truly connected. Later, during a panel discussion, several researchers referenced her remarks. One even suggested incorporating aspects of her routine into future intervention models. She was invited to sit in on additional sessions, and one speaker, a leading gerontologist from Stanford, approached her personally and said, "You didn't just present data. You reminded us of the human side of aging. That's rare." Emotionally, the experience was affirming, yet sobering. Grace realized that her voice mattered more than she had ever imagined. But with that voice came responsibility. That night, alone in her hotel room, she performed her routine without skipping a beat. The bed was too soft, the room unfamiliar, but her body moved through the stretches like muscle memory. The tea calmed her nerves, and her journal entry was simple: "I did it. I showed up. I mattered." When she returned home, she was greeted with flowers from Amy and a banner drawn by Jake that read, "You're famous." She laughed and hugged them both tightly. "Not famous," she corrected. "Just focused." Life settled into a new rhythm. Grace began mentoring others formally, through weekly Zoom sessions and local workshops. She helped people tweak their routines, advised on anti-inflammatory nutrition, and encouraged them to track progress not with numbers but with feelings. Do you wake up stronger? Do you walk steadier? Are you falling less? The stories that came back were astounding. One woman regained enough balance to stop using a cane. A man wrote that his nighttime pain was reduced to nearly nothing since adding Grace's stretches and protein snack. Another senior couple said it saved their marriage, because they were finally sleeping through the night without pain. These stories fueled Grace's purpose. They reminded her that what she had built was bigger than herself. And yet, she remained disciplined. The more attention she received, the more she returned to the very things that had sustained her from the beginning. Her bedtime routine remained sacred. She protected it from overscheduling, from burnout, from ego. One evening, during a particularly long day of back-to-back sessions and calls, Amy noticed her mother looking fatigued. "You don't have to do it all, Mom," she said gently. "You can say no." Grace nodded. "I know. That's why I say yes to myself every night. That's what keeps me going." The chapter introduced a small but powerful subplot, Robert. Their morning walks continued, and their conversations grew deeper. One morning, under a canopy of amber leaves, Robert confessed he was developing feelings for Grace. He didn't ask for a relationship or make it awkward. He simply said, "Being near you reminds me of who I want to be again." Grace was touched. She didn't answer immediately, but that night, she reflected on it as she stretched. She realized that part of growing stronger was opening her heart again, not rushing, not replacing the past, but making space. She wrote in her journal, "Maybe love at this age is gentler. Maybe it's not about passion. Maybe it's about peace." The chapter followed the climax-hope climax rhythm, the climax of the conference and its emotional intensity, the hope of widespread impact and personal growth, and the quieter, more private climax of emotional vulnerability and new beginnings. It emphasized not just external achievements but internal shifts, the transformation of self-image, the acceptance of love, the mastery of personal health. It also deepened the sensory richness of Grace's world, the scent of lavender on her wrists, the feeling of stretched muscle loosening into comfort, the smooth grip of her tea mug, the weight of Robert's hand brushing against hers. The chapter closed with Grace sitting on her porch at sunset, a blanket across her lap, Jake playing quietly in the yard, and Amy reading a book beside her. Robert arrived with a small container of homemade soup. "Dinner?" he asked, shyly. Grace smiled. "Stay," she said. Later, after dishes were cleaned and goodnights exchanged, she moved into her room, turned on her diffuser, dimmed the lights, and began her routine. Each movement felt familiar, but now it carried a new awareness, not just of muscles and breath, but of connection, of time, of what still lay ahead. She finished her stretches, sipped her tea, and opened her journal. "Tonight," she wrote, "we don't stop growing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop believing we can grow. And I'm just getting started." She turned off the light and let her breath carry her into the calm of sleep, her body stronger than ever, her spirit quietly radiant. Autumn settled across the town like a comforting quilt, crisp air replacing the sticky humidity of summer and leaves turning every sidewalk into a mosaic of reds, oranges, and golds. Grace loved this time of year. It carried a quiet urgency that mirrored her own spirit, a reminder that life was always moving, but not without beauty. With the success of her conference speech and her steadily growing presence in the wellness space, Grace had more opportunities than ever. Universities reached out to collaborate, local news stations invited her to speak about senior health, and several nursing homes requested her help designing bedtime wellness routines for their residents. It all felt surreal, yet completely earned. Still, she refused to let any of it interfere with her own practice. Each night she honored her body with movement, nourishment, and stillness. The benefits weren't just physical anymore, they were emotional, spiritual. The act of taking care of herself reminded her daily of her value, her purpose. Her routine became her way of rooting into the present even as the world pulled her forward. Her relationship with Robert continued to bloom. It wasn't fast or fiery. It was gentle and deliberate, the way two people who had lived full lives learned to fall into step with each other again. They shared lunches, walked most mornings, and sometimes cooked dinner together. On colder evenings, he'd stay until it was time for her routine, always leaving with a soft, "Good night, Grace," as if the act of respecting her boundaries was its own kind of love language. One night, as she was rolling out her yoga mat, Robert asked if he could stay just to observe. "I'm curious," he said, "about what makes this so powerful." Grace nodded and invited him to sit in the chair by her window. She moved through her stretches with grace and ease, explaining the purpose behind each one, the hamstring release for lower back support, the hip openers to relieve pressure in the spine, the shoulder rollouts that helped reduce nighttime tension. Then she sat on the bed with her tea and let him read aloud from her gratitude journal. "You're not just stretching your muscles," he said afterward. "You're stretching your life." That line stayed with her. She wrote it down that night. Her story was no longer just hers, it was becoming a guide for others. The muscle preservation study wrapped up that month, and the preliminary results confirmed what Grace already knew. Her nighttime routine had dramatically improved her sleep quality, reduced inflammation markers, and led to noticeable increases in balance, strength, and flexibility. But more importantly, participants who had followed similar routines reported higher emotional resilience and less anxiety about aging. Grace read the final report with tears in her eyes. If this were a pill, one researcher had written, it would be called a miracle. Grace smiled. Her miracle came in the form of 10 quiet minutes on the floor, a warm drink, and a commitment to keep going. She decided it was time to compile her full story, her fall, her discovery, her transformation, into a book. Amy helped her outline it, Jake insisted on designing the cover, and Robert offered to proofread. They worked together every weekend, turning old blog posts into chapters, filling in the gaps with emotional detail, crafting something honest and useful. The book would be called Evening Strength, One Woman's Path to Muscle, Healing, and Hope. As she wrote, Grace uncovered memories she hadn't fully processed, the grief of Frank's passing, the early fear of losing her independence, the nights she cried silently after her fall, wondering if life had already closed its doors on her. But alongside that pain was a steady thread of perseverance. She realized that strength wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was the ability to wake up after another restless night and still try again. It was choosing to move even when movement hurt. It was choosing stillness when noise felt easier. She wrote each chapter with that in mind, offering not just tips or lists, but stories. She shared how the magnesium tea helped soothe her legs after long days, how certain songs helped her fall asleep, how writing down just 3 things each night shifted her entire perspective. She even included her mistakes, like the time she skipped 2 nights in a row and paid for it with sore joints and sleeplessness. The routine doesn't punish me when I miss it, she wrote. It simply waits. Patiently. Like a trusted friend. One chilly Friday evening, Grace received a message that made her pause. It was from a woman named Linda, a caregiver for her 83-year-old father who had late-stage Parkinson's. Linda wrote, "I know your routine can't cure him. But since we started doing it together, he sleeps through the night. He even smiles more. You gave me a way to connect with him when I thought I had lost him." Grace put down the phone, her hands trembling slightly. That was the moment she knew this work was bigger than she had imagined. Her routine wasn't just about protecting muscle. It was about restoring dignity. That weekend, she hosted her first in-person workshop since the conference. Over 30 people came, many of them seniors with canes, walkers, or weary eyes. She greeted each one by name, handed them a rolled mat and a printout of her routine, and began. The workshop was held in a local church hall, warm with candlelight and quiet music. She led them through her movements, speaking gently, offering modifications, reminding them to listen to their bodies. Then they sat in silence and wrote 3 things they were grateful for. Some cried. Others simply sat still, breathing deeper than they had in weeks. Grace watched the room and thought, this is healing. Real healing. That night, at home, Robert surprised her with a small gift, a bracelet engraved with the words, "Still Becoming." She ran her fingers over the letters, "Overcome." "That's what I see in you," he said softly. "And that's what you give to all of us." The chapter crescendoed here, following the emotional arc from personal affirmation to collective healing. The structure of climax hope climax was subtle yet powerful, the emotional climax of the workshop and its impact, the hope in Linda's message, and the private climax of realizing just how deeply her story resonated. Grace went to bed that night emotionally full. She moved through her routine not just for herself anymore, but for Linda's father. For the women in the workshop. For the quiet readers who didn't comment or write but who showed up each night, stretch by stretch. She drank her tea, turned the pages of her journal slowly, and smiled as she wrote, "I used to be afraid that I was fading. Now I see, I'm finally shining, just in a softer light." As she turned out the light and lay down, her body melted into the mattress, relaxed but powerful, aged but alive. There was still more to do, more to give, more to grow. But for tonight, Her work was done. The silence of sleep wrapped around her like a well-earned exhale. The first snow of the season came quietly, blanketing the neighborhood in a soft hush that made even the busiest streets sound like whispers. Grace stood at her living room window, watching flakes drift past the porch light, each one a small miracle of design. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and held her cup of tea with both hands, the warmth grounding her in the moment. The day had been long, interviews, messages, edits on her manuscript, but standing there in the quiet, she felt the kind of peace that only comes from a life lived in alignment. Her phone buzzed with a message from Amy: "Stay warm. Jake wants to come help you shovel tomorrow. He says you're not allowed to touch a snowflake without supervision." Grace laughed, her heart glowing. "Tell him I'll leave the shovel out for the expert," she replied. As she made her way to her bedroom, she moved with the same grace and intentionality that had become her rhythm. Her body no longer felt like something separate, something to manage, it was her companion, her collaborator. The stretches came easily, her joints fluid, muscles responsive. She could feel the strength that had taken months to rebuild living in her bones. That night, she fell asleep quickly, her sleep deep and uninterrupted, her dreams soft and fleeting. The next morning brought sunlight glinting off ice-lace trees and a boy bundled in 3 layers bouncing up her front steps. Jake came in carrying a snow shovel taller than he was, his cheeks red with excitement. "Grandma, the snow's perfect. It crunches like popcorn." Grace smiled and pulled on her boots. Together they cleared the walkway, and Grace marveled at how much easier the work felt than the winter before. No soreness. No stumbling. Her body moved confidently, responding with the kind of balance and agility she had once feared lost forever. Afterward, they shared hot cocoa and leftover scones in the kitchen. Jake asked her about the book. "Is it done yet?" he asked, licking chocolate off his top lip. "Almost," Grace said. "But I want to make sure I say it just right. I want people to feel what I felt. Not just read about it." Jake nodded, looking far older in that moment than his age. "Then just tell them how it saved your muscles and your heart. You always say that's what it did. Out of the mouths of babes." Grace hugged him tightly and whispered, "You're smarter than you know." In the weeks that followed, Grace finalized the book. The last chapters wove together testimonials from her followers, stories from workshops, and reflections from her own late-night journal entries. She included a full breakdown of her bedtime routine with detailed illustrations, nutritional guidelines for muscle support, and gentle reminders like, "Consistency over intensity," and, "Progress is quiet until it isn't." The manuscript was sent to her publisher just after New Year's. She marked the moment not with fanfare but with stillness, lighting a candle, breathing deeply, and moving through her bedtime routine with a sense of reverence. That night she wrote, "This book isn't an ending. It's a beginning for someone else. I've passed the baton." By February, the buzz was building. Pre-orders exceeded expectations. Bloggers reviewed advanced copies and called it a masterclass in aging with intention. Several physical therapists reached out to ask if they could use it in their practices. Grace remained humble but proud. Not for the accolades, but for what it all meant. People were choosing to take control. People were choosing strength. And then came the email that changed everything. A producer from a national daytime talk show reached out. They had seen the viral clip from her workshop and read an excerpt from her book. "We'd love to have Grace on the show," the message read. "To share her journey and demonstrate a bedtime routine that's changing lives." Grace stared at the screen. She hadn't planned for this. The thought of flying to New York, of sitting under studio lights, of being interviewed on live television, it all felt impossibly big. She called Amy. "Tell me I'm not crazy for being scared." Amy's voice was calm. "You're not crazy, Mom. But you are ready. You've been preparing for this every single night." That night, Grace did her routine as if her life depended on it. Every breath, every stretch was a return to center. She whispered as she moved, I am enough. I am prepared. I am already living the story I want to share. She drank her tea slowly, wrote her 3 gratitudes, my courage. My children. My body's memory. And closed her eyes with a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The trip was short. She flew in 2 days before the show, stayed in a quiet hotel overlooking the park, and rehearsed her segment with a producer who was surprisingly warm. You're going to be amazing, the producer said. Just talk like you're helping a friend. The day of the show came quickly. Grace sat in the green room, the scent of hairspray and coffee in the air, heart beating a steady rhythm that somehow soothed rather than scared her. When she stepped onto the stage, applause washed over her like sunlight. The host greeted her warmly. Please welcome Grace Atwood, author of Evening Strength, a woman redefining what aging looks like. Grace smiled, waved, and took her seat. The interview flowed easily. She told her story, the fall, the fear, the rebuilding, and then, on a soft carpet placed center stage, she demonstrated part of her routine, the knee chest stretch, the seated spinal twist, the supported forward fold. She explained how each move helped restore flexibility, reduce inflammation, and prepare the body for rest. The audience was silent, captivated. At the end, the host turned to her and asked, if you could tell every older adult watching just one thing, what would it be? Grace looked straight into the camera and said, you're not too late. Your body is still listening. Start tonight. 1 stretch. 1 breath. You might be surprised how strong you still are. The crowd erupted in applause. As she walked off stage, several staff members approached her, hairstylists, camera operators, even a janitor, each saying some version of, I needed to hear that. Back in her hotel room that night, Grace sat in bed, tea in hand, journal open. Her muscles hummed with energy but not exhaustion. She wrote, I did it. Not for fame. Not for attention. But because someone, somewhere, is going to stretch tonight for the first time because they saw me. And that's enough. The story arc of the chapter followed her from self-doubt to visibility, from quiet nights at home to the national stage, from routine to revolution. It was a climax of external validation balanced by internal peace. She was the same woman who had once cried in frustration after a failed attempt at a basic stretch. Only now, she had reached thousands, and she was far from finished. The chapter closed with her turning out the hotel room lights, lying back on the unfamiliar pillow, and smiling as she whispered to the ceiling, we're not done yet, old girl. Not even close. The morning after the show aired, Grace awoke to her phone buzzing with messages, emails, and missed calls. Her appearance had struck a chord with people all over the country. Messages poured in from viewers who saw themselves in her story, retired teachers, widowed grandparents, exhausted caregivers. I did your stretch routine last night, one message read. First full night's sleep I've had in weeks. Another said, my mother and I watched together and cried. We've been distant for years, but now we have a reason to sit together each night. Grace read each one slowly, holding space for the emotions behind them. These weren't just compliments. They were confirmations. Her words and routine were not only practical, they were healing. The flood of attention didn't inflate her ego. If anything, it deepened her commitment. She returned home to a mailbox stuffed with letters. Handwritten notes came from every corner of the country. One in particular stood out. A letter from a woman named Etta in rural Montana who had just turned 82. I've spent years feeling like my body was failing me. But last night, for the first time in a decade, I didn't go to bed with dread. I followed your video. I did it slowly, but I did it. I felt like I was taking back a piece of myself. Grace held the letter against her chest and cried, not out of sadness, but in awe of what quiet courage could inspire. Her days filled quickly with interviews, podcast requests, invitations to wellness retreats. She was offered brand partnerships, but she turned most of them down. If it doesn't align with the truth of what got me here, she told Amy, then it's not worth it. She wasn't interested in selling supplements or chasing followers. What mattered was keeping the message clean. Small, consistent actions could reclaim strength, dignity, and independence. She agreed to one partnership, with a nonprofit that worked with senior centers to build better nighttime care routines. Together, they launched a pilot program called the Evening Strength Project. Grace provided guidance, sample schedules, and video demonstrations tailored for group settings. Facilities from California to Maine signed up. Some began including bedtime stretch sessions led by staff. Others brought in local instructors to lead guided wind downs with calming music and gentle encouragement. Reports came back of reduced fall rates, calmer sleep, and improved morale. Grace beamed with pride but always circled back to her roots. "This started in my living room," she reminded everyone. "You don't need anything fancy. Just a little space and a little belief." At home, life remained beautifully simple. Jake came over on weekends, sometimes filming short videos for Grace's growing YouTube channel. Amy handled the technical details, managing uploads, scheduling newsletters, and monitoring feedback. Robert remained a steady, comforting presence. They continued their quiet mornings and warm dinners. One evening, after the dishes were cleared and Jake had gone home with Amy, Robert stayed behind. Grace sat with her tea, the scent of chamomile rising like a prayer. "I want to ask you something," Robert said, fiddling with a folded napkin. Grace looked up. "Of course. What we have. It feels right. I don't want to rush or pressure anything, but I was wondering, would you ever consider moving in together?" Grace blinked, surprised but not unsettled. She looked into his kind eyes, the quiet steadiness in his posture, the years of experience etched into his hands. "That's not something I ever thought I'd do again," she admitted. "But I think maybe, yes. Not today. Not next week. But maybe someday soon." Robert smiled, no urgency in his expression. Just warmth. That's all I needed to hear. That night, as she moved through her bedtime routine, Grace found herself moving slower, not from fatigue but from intention. Her body had changed so much, stronger in places she'd once ignored, looser where she'd once felt locked. But more than that, her spirit had stretched, softened, and strengthened in equal measure. She journaled that night, "Love at this age is different. It's not about rescuing each other. It's about being whole and choosing to stand side by side anyway." The following weekend, Grace held a community event at the wellness center titled Stronger Together, Bedtime Health for Every Body. Over 60 people attended, including young caregivers, couples in their 80s, and even a few high schoolers earning community service credits. She led them through a simple routine, adding moments of reflection between movements. "As you stretch your arms," she said gently, "think about what you've carried this year. As you stretch your legs, think about where you're going. As you breathe, think about who you've become." Many left in tears. Others stayed behind just to hug her. Later, when she returned home, she found a message waiting from her publisher. Her book had made the bestseller list for health and wellness. Grace sat in silence for a long time, absorbing it. Her story, a fall in a grocery store, a few minutes of nightly stretching, a warm cup of tea, was now resonating on a national level. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her greatest moment of weakness had led to her greatest strength. But fame didn't change her routine. That night she did the same stretches, drank the same tea, wrote the same 3 gratitudes. "The snow," she wrote. Robert's question. "My feet, still steady." The routine didn't ask her to become someone else. It asked her to return to herself. Always. A few days later, she received a message from Dr. Carter, the head of the research study that had first validated her work. The university wanted to build a formal curriculum based on Grace's bedtime routine, complete with research-based modules and training guides for assisted living staff. They wanted to name it the Atwood Protocol. Grace laughed aloud when she read that. Sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, she texted Amy. But when she thought about it more deeply, it filled her with quiet pride. This wasn't ego. This was legacy. She was building something that could live on, even after she was gone. The chapter followed the emotional arc from validation to deepening impact, from the national stage to the quiet intimacy of her living room. The climax-hope-climax structure played out in the major developments, her rising national influence, the vulnerability of Robert's question, and the affirmation of her legacy through formal adoption of her method. But all the while, the constant thread was the routine, the anchor through celebration and uncertainty alike. The chapter ended with a familiar ritual. Grace placed her tea on the nightstand, sat cross-legged on her mat, and took 3 deep breaths. She moved through her stretches, her body both teacher and student. Then she knelt beside the bed, reached for her journal, and wrote just one sentence: "My life changed because I decided to stretch." And with that, she turned off the lamp, slid under the covers, and drifted into sleep knowing that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been afraid to start. And every person who now would. The wind outside pressed softly against the windows, not with the force of a storm but with the persistent rhythm of early spring, restless and stirring. Grace stood in the kitchen early that morning, her hands wrapped around her favorite mug, watching a robin hop across the fence. The house was quiet. Amy had taken Jake on a weekend trip to visit cousins, and Robert had gone to help his daughter fix a leaky faucet. For the first time in what felt like months, Grace was completely alone. And instead of loneliness, she felt space, open, welcoming space to reflect. The book had been out for 3 months now, and it was still climbing charts, still sparking conversations online and on morning TV segments. Grace received photos almost daily, strangers from Missouri, Arizona, Ohio, kneeling beside their beds or stretching in living rooms, a copy of Evening Strength laid out beside them. Her inbox was overflowing with gratitude and questions. People wanted more stretches, more ideas, more connection. And as much as she was honored by the impact, Grace knew she had to protect the stillness that had birthed it all. That morning, after sipping her tea, she opened a new notebook, blank, leather-bound, a gift from Robert. On the first page she wrote, "What now?" Not in defeat or fear, but in curiosity. In the week since her talk show appearance, she had been approached by networks offering her a recurring wellness segment, by publishers suggesting a second book, and by tech companies who wanted to develop an app around her bedtime routine. She had turned them all down for now. "This isn't a business," she told Amy. "It's a practice. And practices need space." Still, she felt the pull. Not of ambition, but of responsibility. More people were listening. If she didn't step forward with intention, someone else might distort what she had built. Later that afternoon, she took a walk by the river trail. The path was mostly empty, and she let her mind drift with the current of the water beside her. She thought of the early days, her frustration, her pain, the helplessness she had carried like a second skin. She remembered what it felt like to lie in bed and wonder if this was the beginning of the end. And she remembered the first time she stretched again, how even that small motion had felt like a rebellion. She stopped at a bench, sat, and pulled out her notebook. "Maybe it's time," she wrote. "Not to go bigger, but to go deeper." The following week, Grace announced a new idea, the Evening Circle, a small, subscription-based community built around connection, routine, and resilience. No ads. No products. Just a space where people could gather virtually, share progress, ask questions, and receive weekly prompts, videos, and encouragement. She kept the price low, and she capped membership to preserve intimacy. Within 48 hours, every spot was filled. Members ranged from caregivers to retirees to middle-aged parents of aging loved ones. One man wrote, "I joined for my dad, but I ended up staying for me." Each week, Grace shared short videos of herself moving through her evening stretches, reading from her journal, offering tips she had learned, how to adjust a stretch for a sore hip, what teas helped with inflammation, which breathing pattern calmed her most. But she also listened. She read every comment, responded to every message, and invited members to co-create the space. "What do you need?" she asked often. "What's keeping you going?" She posted the same reflective question each Sunday night: "What surprised you this week?" And the answers were always raw and beautiful. "I stood up without holding the wall. I slept through the night. My grandson joined me for stretches. I cried when I realized I'm not invisible anymore." Grace printed some of the posts and taped them beside her desk. They weren't just testimonials. They were proof. Her small act of defiance, choosing to move instead of surrender, had started something that mattered. Around this time, Robert invited her to visit his childhood home in Vermont. "The old house is empty, but I still like to check in once a year," he said. "There's a lake nearby, and the stars are something else." They drove up on a crisp Thursday morning, the car packed with snacks and a few paperbacks. The house sat on a hill overlooking a quiet expanse of pine forest, the lake visible through the trees. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faint cedar. Grace ran her hand along the worn railing and imagined all the lives lived there. "You grew up here?" she asked. "Every summer," Robert replied. "I learned to swim in that lake and ride a bike on that gravel road." That evening, they sat on the back porch under a wide sky. No city lights. No traffic. Just silence and stars. Grace rolled out her travel mat on the wooden floor inside, lit a small travel candle, and invited Robert to join her. He moved carefully through the stretches, occasionally glancing over for guidance. When they finished, they sat side by side with mugs of hot tea. "I never thought I'd stretch before bed," he said with a chuckle. "But now I see, it's not just stretching. It's listening. To your body. To your heart." Grace smiled. "Exactly." That night, in the guest room with its antique quilt and creaky windows, she wrote in her travel journal, "Stillness is not the absence of movement. It's the presence of meaning." Upon returning home, Grace found a letter from Etta, the woman from Montana. Inside was a photo, Etta sitting in her modest living room, legs stretched out in front of her, her hands resting on her knees, eyes closed in peace. Behind her, a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, mimicked her pose. "This is my great-grandson, Luke," the letter said. "He says, we stretch because Grandma's muscles are strong. Thank you, Grace. You helped me give him a memory of strength, not struggle." Grace stared at the photo for a long time. This was legacy. Not headlines. Not book rankings. This. The shared ritual between generations. The passing of strength not through genetics, but through practice. Through presence. The emotional climax of the chapter wasn't loud or public. It was private, quiet. The way most healing moments are. A woman sitting in a chair in Montana. A child watching her. A ripple sent forward. The story followed the climax-hope-climax pattern, the quiet space after the storm of publicity, the hopeful formation of the evening circle, the emotional impact of Vermont and Etta's letter. It reinforced the truth Grace had come to live: the most profound growth doesn't always come from expansion, but from deepening roots. That night, her routine was especially tender. She moved slowly, her breath deep, her stretches deliberate. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "For Etta. For Luke. For everyone who still believes it's too late." Then she picked up her pen and wrote just 5 words: stretch. Soften. Strengthen. Still. Stay. She turned off the light and let the dark hold her gently. There was nothing more she needed to be in that moment than exactly herself: woman, healer, grandmother, guide. The seasons shifted again, slowly, as they always did, first with the scent of rain on dry sidewalks, then with the gentle bloom of cherry blossoms dusting the corners of the park where Grace walked most mornings. Spring had come, not in a burst but in a quiet unfurling, and with it came a deeper clarity in Grace's heart. Her world had expanded so quickly over the last year that she had barely had time to stop and process all that had changed. But now, in the slow rhythm of longer days and cool evenings, she found herself looking inward again, not out of necessity or pain, but out of reverence. Her body continued to surprise her. At a recent checkup, her physician marveled at the improvements in her blood work, muscle tone, and bone density. "Whatever you're doing," the doctor said, "keep doing it." Grace had smiled softly. "I just stretch and breathe," she replied, "and I never go to bed angry at my body anymore." The truth was, she had begun to see her bedtime routine not just as self-care but as self-respect. Each night was an act of reconciliation between herself and the years she had spent pushing, punishing, or ignoring the signals her body sent. Now, she listened. Now, she responded. One April afternoon, Grace received a letter that stopped her in her tracks. It was from the university that had sponsored the original muscle preservation study. They wanted to host a special summit, the Longevity Through Routine Conference, and had asked Grace to deliver the keynote address. "You'll be speaking to researchers, caregivers, policymakers," the invitation read. "But most importantly, to a growing movement of people who believe that aging doesn't have to mean decline." The conference was scheduled for mid-May. Grace had just 6 weeks to prepare. At first, she hesitated. Speaking at a wellness expo was one thing, standing before scientists and professionals who had devoted entire careers to this field was something else. "What could I possibly tell them that they don't already know?" she asked Robert one evening over dinner. He set his fork down and looked her in the eye. "You can remind them," he said gently, "what it feels like to live inside the body they're trying to save." That night, Grace didn't write in her journal. She just sat on her mat a little longer than usual, eyes closed, palms open, letting the quiet of her bedroom hold her. The next morning, she began outlining her talk. She decided not to focus on statistics or citations, they would have plenty of that. Instead, she would tell a story. Her story. She would walk them through the fall, the hopelessness, the first painful stretch. She would describe the first night she slept without pain. The first time she stood up from the floor without help. The first time she looked in the mirror and saw power again. "They can measure muscle mass," she wrote, "but they can't measure the moment someone starts believing in themselves again." She spent the next few weeks shaping every sentence with care, speaking the words aloud during her walks, adjusting phrases after reading them during her nighttime tea. She practiced in front of Amy, who gave her notes with the same honesty and love she always had. Jake offered to make it sound cooler, and Grace let him design a simple slide with the title, "Strong by Night, One Woman's Journey Through Routine, Resilience, and Renewal." When the day of the conference arrived, Grace wore a soft navy blouse, her silver hair pinned back simply. The auditorium was filled with professionals, most of them younger than her, notebooks in hand, expressions expectant. When her name was called, she stepped up to the podium with calm resolve. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Grace Atwood. And a little over a year ago, I fell in a grocery store and thought my life was over." The audience leaned in. She spoke for 40 minutes, no teleprompter, no slides beyond the title. Just her voice, steady and warm, weaving a story of pain, discovery, and transformation. She described her routine in vivid detail. "Each stretch wasn't just about my hamstrings or hips," she said. "It was about giving my body a reason to trust me again." She talked about the letters from strangers, the bedtime circles, the way a little boy had said, "Grandma's muscles are strong." When she finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then applause erupted, not polite or perfunctory, but thunderous. People rose to their feet. Grace stood there, hands folded, receiving the moment not as a performance but as a shared truth. Backstage, a researcher approached her with tears in her eyes. "You reminded me why I started in this field," she said. "You brought the science to life." That night, back home, Grace didn't rush her routine. She moved even slower, each motion a silent echo of her speech. As she sat on her bed, she wrote, "I have never felt more powerful. Not because I was heard, but because I told the truth." The emotional structure of the chapter followed a gentle crescendo: preparation, self-doubt, rising courage, and public validation, mirroring the climax-hope-climax model that had become a subtle rhythm in Grace's life. But perhaps the most important moment came the following morning. Grace opened her inbox to find a message from a 72-year-old woman in North Carolina. "I watched your keynote online. I was going to give up. But last night, I got on the floor, just like you said. I cried the whole time. But I did it. Thank you for saving me from disappearing." Grace pressed her hand to her heart. That's why she had said yes. Not for the scientists. Not for the applause. But for that one woman, alone in her living room, trying again. A few days later, Grace took a quiet walk by the lake where she used to sit with Frank. The bench was still there. She sat down and whispered to the breeze, "I think you'd be proud." She imagined Frank smiling, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Took you long enough," he'd probably say, that familiar glint in his eye. Grace laughed out loud. A couple passing by turned to look, and she waved sheepishly. But inside, she felt full. That evening, she hosted a virtual session for her evening circle community. More than 300 members logged in. She led them through a short stretch, then paused. "Tonight," she said, "I want you to say something out loud. Just whisper it if you need to. Say, 'My body is not broken. My strength is still mine.'" Screens flickered with faces, some crying, some smiling, all alive with the truth of her words. Grace finished the session with a final breath. "And remember," she said, "no matter where you are, no matter how far gone you feel, you can begin again tonight." Then she turned off her camera, moved through her own routine, and let the day go. Her bedtime had never felt more sacred. This wasn't just health. It was healing. It began with the sky, as so many important days do, not with fanfare or trumpet calls, but with the slow unraveling of light across the horizon. Grace opened her eyes to that gentle blue morning and felt, before she even moved, the softness of her muscles, the alert calm of her body. It had been well over a year now since the night she first returned to the floor, aching, unsure, and scared, and yet today, she could hardly believe she was the same woman. Not because she'd transformed into something new, but because she'd finally returned to who she had always been. This was not the end of a journey. This was the full breath after a long exhale. The celebration was small by design. Grace had never been one for large parties, but Amy insisted on doing something. "People want to thank you, Mom," she said gently. "And honestly, I think you could use a moment to just, let it all in." So they arranged a garden gathering at the local wellness center. An open-air courtyard filled with blooming tulips, string lights woven through the lattice, and soft jazz humming from the corner speakers. About 80 people came, former students from her workshops, readers of her book, members of the evening circle who had flown in just to meet her, healthcare providers who had adopted her bedtime routine in their clinics. There were tears, laughter, and more hugs than Grace could count. Jake had made a video montage, footage of her early stretches, clips from her virtual sessions, screenshots of heartfelt comments set to a piano melody that made even Robert wipe his eyes. When it ended, everyone stood, clapping and cheering. Grace was overwhelmed, not by noise or attention, but by the realization that her small, private practice had become a collective movement. She stepped to the front with a microphone and took a breath. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "Not for the applause. But for choosing to take care of yourselves. For believing in small beginnings. This," she gestured to the crowd, "is what strength looks like. Not just muscle. But memory. Courage. Connection. This is what happens when you decide not to give up." The applause rose again, but Grace stepped back and let it wash over her like a warm tide. She didn't need to stand in the spotlight. She had already passed the flame. That night, she returned home to find her porch filled with flowers. Bouquets from strangers. Notes taped to pots. A box of chamomile tea with a card that read, "Thank you for giving me my evenings back." Grace smiled as she stepped inside. Her home smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the way it always had. The kitchen was tidy. The teacup was waiting on the counter. She moved through her familiar rhythm, the kettle, the mat, the notebook. But tonight, as she stretched, she added something new. She knelt by the mat and bowed forward, not in pain, but in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "to my body. For remembering how to heal. For forgiving me." She stayed there for a moment longer than usual, breathing deeply, letting the silence speak. After tea and journaling, her 3 gratitudes that night, the wind, the garden, the people I've never met, Grace climbed into bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and let her thoughts drift to the future. The evening circle would continue to grow. She had passed some leadership roles to longtime members and was now mentoring a small group of facilitators. There were whispers of a second book, not about bedtime but about morning rituals, strength at sunrise, Jake had joked. She hadn't said yes yet. But she hadn't said no. She and Robert had started quietly planning to live together full-time by the end of summer. They were in no rush. Grace had finally learned that anything worth keeping would wait for her. Her phone buzzed gently on the nightstand. A message from Amy, "Just wanted to say how proud I am. You gave people hope, Mom. Real, lasting hope." Grace typed back simply, "You helped me believe in myself. Thank you for never letting go." She turned off the lamp and let the dark embrace her. In the quiet, her mind wandered, not restlessly, but like a feather drifting on a slow current. She thought of her first night alone after the fall. Of the helplessness. The ache. The shame. And she thought of what had followed, not all at once, but one breath at a time. She thought of the women who now moved through their routines in Kansas, Oregon, New Hampshire, and beyond. She imagined 1,000 mats rolled out across the country, 1,000 cups of tea steeping, 1,000 people exhaling together in the dark. Grace smiled in the dark. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." And as sleep settled over her, her final thoughts were not of fame or fear or what might come next. They were of stillness. Of movement. Of one small stretch that turned into a revolution. In the months that followed, Grace's name became a quiet touchstone in the world of aging wellness. Her story was taught in graduate programs. Physical therapists cited her work. Grandchildren gifted her book to their grandparents. The bedtime routine lived on, not as a trend, but as a tradition, something sacred passed from one person to the next. And in her little house on the edge of town, Grace continued her nightly ritual. Always. Tea. Breath. Stretch. Gratitude. Rest. In the final entry of the journal she had kept throughout the journey, Grace wrote, "I thought I was losing myself when I fell. But really, I was falling into a new beginning. And every night since, I've chosen to rise again, softly, slowly, strongly." That line would become the closing quote in the revised edition of her book. It would be etched into benches at senior centers. Printed on yoga mats. Whispered in homes where people were learning to love their bodies again. And so, the story ended as it had begun, not with a miracle, but with a question. Not with triumph, but with tenderness. What if you started tonight? What if this time, you didn't quit? What if your body is still listening? Somewhere, someone will kneel beside their bed tonight, unsure and afraid. They'll stretch. They'll breathe. And without even realizing it, they'll begin again. Just like Grace did. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?